Okay, so welcome to the TEL Researchers at Lancaster series with Dr. Marguerite Koole. My name's Vicky Devani. I'm a learning designer at the University of London, and I'm also a PhD student at Lancaster. I would like to introduce the guest more formally. So we've got Dr. Marguerite Koole, who is an associate professor of the Educational Technology and Design Curriculum Studies at the College of Education at the University of Saskatchewan.
So when I was invited to do this, I was really thrilled. Thank you so much. And I'm from the second cohort from the TEL program at Lancaster. And so it's kind of a nice little homecoming here. The title of my presentation, having thought about, I'll talk a little bit about myself, but what would be really interesting to talk about and really engaging and perhaps, I hope, useful for you, is I thought, well, I'll tell you a little bit about my story of becoming an academic. And I thought that we could talk about some of the sticky situations along the way and perhaps how we can make them less adhesive. So let's make these sticky situations a little bit less adhesive, meaning making them better, easier to get through. So here's what I thought I'd talk about is I first would like to find out a little bit about who's here today, because it can help me kind of shape the discourse a little bit. Then I'll tell you a little bit about me. I don't usually like talking about myself, but I do an awful lot of work with my lovely Indigenous colleagues, and they're like, no, Marguerite, you need to position yourself. It's really helpful to us. So I will do that. And also, I thought it was really kind of fascinating to transition from being a PhD student to, I put here an independent scholar. While I do work at an institution, the University of Saskatchewan, I have an awful lot of autonomy and, of course, academic freedom to research interesting areas and whatnot. So I think it's kind of important to start thinking that way if you're currently a student and start thinking about, gee, once I get launched here, I've got a lot of freedom, and with freedom comes responsibility. And then for sticky situations, I thought we'd look at a few things like handling peer reviews or blind reviews from journals and conferences, the sticky question of authorship and who goes first type of thing, and collaborations. I find myself more and more in very large collaborations, and what happens when things are not going so smoothly. However, I don't want you to think this presentation is about doom and gloom. There's good news, there are solutions, there's ways that you can plan your way through these things. And if you're welcome to share at any time, but please don't. I would recommend avoiding making anything personal. In this presentation, I'm using very generalities, and there's no one individual I'm thinking of when I give you a scenario. Okay, so now we're getting ready with poll everywhere, and the very first question I have for you, is where are you from? And if you look closely at your screen, I've got a little marker. I'm approximately from there, actually maybe a little bit more central. I should have maybe put my marker a little more central. And oh, I love this. Okay, we've got somebody from right in the middle of Africa. Wow. And Ireland, and there's going to be a lot of green right there in the British Isles, right? Which is lovely. And I was kind of hoping there'd be some more folks. And if you're seeing the map, that's a good thing. And okay, oh my goodness, way down in South Africa there. Oh, fantastic. And I can't remember what time it is there, but in my collaborations, at any given week, I could be talking to somebody from Africa, from New Zealand, from Indonesia, from, anywhere in the world. So I love this map. There we go. Okay. So now what I'd like to know in general, so this is nice because it doesn't point the finger at anybody, but where are you in your academic career at this point? Okay, lovely. I love that we have a master's student in here. This doesn't give me exact numbers. And by the way, any information that goes in here, it's set to disappear after a day. So, this is not I'm not collecting data at all. And okay, and some other, for anybody who's other, I'd be really curious if you wanted to put in the text chat, if you're willing to share what other is. I love this. It's a nice mix. And what this means is that we can have a lot of sharing of perspectives here. Okay, but also another. Okay, PhD student, but also another. And now, as I'll mention in my own bio, I am the first person in my family to achieve a PhD. After I did my PhD, my brother actually did his MBA. And I've been thinking, like, even my extended cousins, and trying to think of somebody else who has done a PhD. And so this is kind of an interesting situation here. Now, I don't know what the stats are for Britain, but in Canada, less than 1% of the population has a PhD. So, you're on an interesting and unique journey. And also, I'm going to talk a little bit about publishing and authorship. So I was just kind of curious. Okay, so just to see where you land in terms of publishing. I suspect my professor colleagues have done a heck of a lot of publishing. One of the things that I really appreciated about the Lancaster program when I took it was that during the modules, we were encouraged to do small research projects, and I published at least 2 of them when I was a student, and I really encourage that. And now that I have my own master's and PhD students, I try to encourage them to publish when they can. And going through that peer review process is an interesting situation, but it's highly worthwhile, and we'll be talking about that shortly. And have you presented a paper at an academic conference? Because again, these are sources for you throughout your career to continue to learn, to have those dialogues and discourses with colleagues in your field. So, okay, 73% yes so far. Fantastic. Okay. Sue posted 2%. Is that 2% of, yeah, people in the UK have a PhD? Interesting. Okay, now I know. Okay, so thank you for sharing a little bit about yourselves. So it actually gives me a sense of who I'm talking to. Now, for me, I grew up on a farm. It was, I'm very, very lucky. I had kind of an idyllic childhood full of lots of curiosity. One summer, no, it wasn't summer, it was during a school year, my brother and I built our own still in the backyard, in the trees, of course, where we could have burned down the trees. And, just bringing home ideas from school and thinking about, oh, hey, let's find some scraps of alcohol here. And all we were doing really was separating alcohol from water. But, we were kids and thought this was really cool. And, we did a lot of digging of holes and things, climbing on buildings and whatnot. So I'm super blessed. And I want to mention at this point too, I always forget this and I shouldn't, but I am on Treaty 6 territory, and most Canadians are located in treaty lands. And so when I grew up in, gosh, was it Treaty 4? Anyways, it was the homeland of the Blackfoot, and I now live on the homeland of the Cree. Oh my goodness. There's a number of people here that I shouldn't forget. And also the Métis. And so super blessed to be here. I am the first person in my family to achieve a master's and PhD. And I'm looking at generations. There's actually quite a few people with bachelor's degrees in my family. But and then prior to my PhD studies, I was an instructional designer at Athabasca University. the difference between instructional designer and learning designer, there's some interesting similarities and differences that I wrote about with Dr. Gail Parkoma before she passed. And my goal when I started my PhD was actually personal interest, because I really liked learning. I really enjoyed the process of doing my master's. I know I'm a total geek. And I would have been very, very happy to remain an instructional designer, but I was open to becoming a professor at some point. And I just, I was happy with whichever way the wind blew there. And as Vicky has introduced me, I'm currently an associate professor at a Canadian university. So I've been at the University of Saskatchewan from 2014 to the present. When I started, I started as an untenured assistant professor. My position was not tenure track, which was kind of interesting because we kind of picked up and moved for a one-year position. But then the subsequent year, the exact same tenure track position came up, and I succeeded in getting it in 2015. And so I went from assistant professor of about 3 years later, I achieved my tenure. A year later, associate professor, and this is where I am right now. And I was going to say, I'm going to give you a little bit of background here because it relates to the next slide. So when I began at the U of S, I had, of course, finished my PhD with Lancaster, and it was on identity, positioning, and network learning. I was really interested in digital identity and how we portray ourselves online and how people interpret our portrayals of ourselves. My thesis was written from a social construction of reality perspective. And then shortly after my PhD, I went to this fabulous conference in Manchester, and I was introduced to sociomaterialism and new materialism, and it challenged my conceptions of the social construction of reality and where I fit with it. And I remember I was at the conference and I phoned my supervisor, Gail, and I said, "What is this thing, this sociomaterialism? What?" And I was quite disturbed by it, but then I got super interested in it and read several books, and now it's kind of a main area of research for me. My PhD was informed by phenomenography, but because I had started with a theoretical framework, I couldn't say it was a phenomenographic study, but I maintain that it was highly informed by phenomenography. And again, in writing papers through the modules at Lancaster, which I think is a huge strength, I tried some social network analysis, phenomenology, case study, and it was fabulous having that breadth and the experience of writing these different papers and publishing them in those strains. For my Master of Education, I did it with Athabasca University, which is Canada's open university. So it's a distance university. I don't know, it's been in the news lately for a variety of political reasons, where all the students, they must have about 40,000 students, and they work primarily at a distance. And now, since COVID, the faculty and staff all went home, worked by a distance, and now the government has been trying to make them come back on site, which makes no sense to some of them. But I'm not going to weigh into the political issues going on there. It is actually more complex than I'm making it sound. I also had a college diploma in multimedia production prior to doing my Master's of Education, where I did various technologies, video, audio. I learned how to program. I learned some visual design, animation. So, lots of skills there. HTML, of course. And my original degree in modern languages was in French and Spanish, which interestingly enough has come around. All of this has come around full circle, and all of this now informs my research. And so the reason I went through my background like that is because when you transition from being a PhD student and working at a university, if that's your goal, it is a transition period where you kind of you are hired for a reason, right? Because your skills and your knowledge and what you have done in the past fits into the position that they want, and they what you want to teach. For me, my current position fit like a glove. It was in some ways well, yeah, it was I landed in a very, very good position. And but the struggle kind of came not so much with starting to teach, which is interesting, because I had done a lot of teaching in the past, but it was in establishing my program of research. So, I mean, I had very strong interests in what I did for my PhD, very strong interests in mobile learning. And so I land at this institution and I start to realize that, there's a really important, significant context here. And it's at your department level. So, I mean, you're teaching and filling a position at a department level. And you're going to have these colleagues around you who have interesting areas of research. And then, you're at an institution and the institution's going to have some priorities. And then there's a provincial layer because the province will have priorities. Some of the funding trickling into the institution will be related to those priorities. And then finally, I recommend being aware of what is going on at a national level, at the granting agency level and the political level, and being aware of what kinds of shifts are happening in your country as a whole. And so why am I talking about this? Like, why do you need to contextualize your work? Well, you don't have to contextualize your work, but you're going to co-construct your place in academia, I think. And I certainly did. And so, and when you're co-constructing your place, it's going to be reflected likely in what you're teaching, because you might develop new courses for areas of need. So for example, in my institution right now, there's a very strong push towards indigenization. Of course, nobody can define indigenization. And if you ask our Indigenous scholars versus our administration, they don't necessarily agree. Some don't like the word indigenization anyways. It's being used. And so that is like, this is one example of where there's an institutional priority. I mean, we also, because I'm in the prairies, there's also a huge emphasis on agricultural research, food sustainability. And so you start to look at those things. And the reason why you sometimes need to be pragmatic is that in order to engage in medium and large projects, you might need funding. And so on the one hand, yes, you want to remain true to your interests in, what has driven you towards doing the research in the field that you've done. Like, there must be some compelling reason that you chose the topic you did for your PhD. And at the same time, you can keep moving forward in that if it can somehow meet the needs of the various layers and the context that envelop you. And feel free, if you have comments, Sue, if you have any words of wisdom you'd like to share, don't feel like I'm pushing you or anything, but other people's experience might be different. But I found that I was, really, there was an emergence of my program of research. And okay, so in terms of program of research, I'm calling it a POR. So it actually took me a while, and I'm actually seeing a colleague of mine who's been here for about 3 years, and I'm detecting some frustration with, obtaining the grants and still kind of finding direction. And it took me 3 or 4 years. So I had lots of ideas, of course, and I had this wonderful toolkit that I brought with me to the university, but it took a while. And you need to be open to possibilities. You need to be aware of what's going on around you for those opportunities. Now, before COVID hit, I got together some colleagues from computer science, Indigenous studies, my colleagues in my own college of education, and said, you know, there's a real gap in the teaching and learning of Indigenous languages. In 2017, for example, I had or not for example, but the start of this happened when I had a visiting student, an honor student from Germany, come for the summer on a research program. And we scanned the Canadian context for any digital tools that were designed to foster teaching and learning in Indigenous languages. And what we found were, we found about 153, whether they were podcasts, websites, apps, anything digital, videos, YouTube, but we found about 153 items. And if you consider that there's 60 plus individual languages, individual Indigenous languages in Canada, the population isn't huge, but that didn't seem like a lot. And then of those, I would say, gosh, the stats are on the website, but I'd say maybe 80 of them were dictionary apps, like simple dictionary apps with pictures and that kind of thing, and which are really important. You need your dictionaries when you're learning a language, but there wasn't really anything to teach grammar and morphology and whatnot. So a little light bulb clicked on, and I said, you know what, let's conceptualize an app. So we sought funding. We got about $100,000 from the Canadian Internet Registry Authority, and it was supposed to be a one-year project. COVID hit. I didn't want to go to the reserve where my colleague Kevin Lewis was, because I didn't want to bring COVID there, and so communications became difficult. But then he got Starlink. So later on, we were able to communicate much better. And so, the Canadian Internet Registry Authority was absolutely wonderful to work with. They allowed us to stretch into a second year. And we have a strong prototype at this point. And I know I'm going into detail here. I didn't want to burden you with details, but the app allows teachers or anybody with no technical knowledge to log in, create lessons. And it's really designed to teach for morphology, which are the little word parts like prefixes, suffixes, infixes, roots, and whatnot. And then they are visible immediately upon publishing on the mobile app. But after we got to that point, we realized that there are some really big issues in data management, because our Indigenous peoples, they have had European researchers, and I'm European, I'm not picking on anybody from Europe, but Western trained researchers coming into their communities, using them for research, leaving. Relationships are gone when they leave, and they take the data with them, and the people, didn't get a lot of benefits from Western research. And now, rightfully, they're concerned about maintaining control over their cultural knowledge, including their language. That's a huge aspect of your cultural knowledge. And so we realize that we're at a point now where we need to provide some middleware in the system that allow communities to determine who gets access and how and why and when. There's stories that can only be told, for example, in certain seasons like winter or summer, and they should have a fairly granular way of controlling when stories can be accessed. Anyway, so that's a project. We want to apply for another substantial grant to be able to visit communities and talk to them about their needs for controlling knowledge in digital environments. In the meantime, over my sabbatical in the last year, I was working with Professor John Traxler at Wolverhampton University, who is now a UNESCO chair. And we started a project called Decolonization of Digital Learning Spaces, where we are interested in working with communities around the world who are from rural or marginalized or remote communities and working with them to better understand what their learning processes are, and trying to find methods. And they can be Western European methods, but we're also interested in any kinds of methods that they use for sharing their ways of knowing. And then from there, once we have established some of these methods, we can then talk to them better and be more informed and helpful in designing digital learning spaces. And so the program of research, interestingly enough, I was really overwhelmed this summer because both of these are huge projects and trying to carve out the time to write these grants. And I thought, oh my God, I've got 2 programs of research here. And then when I started writing some grants, and then I started dipping into literature from both of these projects, and I realized that really I'm actually in one program of research. I just need to find the name for it, but I'm seeing tremendous overlap between these. And I do recommend moving forward, if you take on either a position at a university or if you decide to be an independent researcher, one program of research is enough. You don't want more than that. So I'm actually dovetailing these things, and I actually did spend some time this summer also turning down some opportunities, removing myself from some projects, because you can very easily become overwhelmed by saying yes to too many things. And then I added onto this slide that your supervision of students, your teaching, I think if you're doing things right, those things are going to match up with your program of research too, because there's a great deal of richness that you can bring into your classroom and your supervision, that from your projects, and vice versa. Students having opportunities to work on those projects or knowing about them and asking you those questions that you never expected or never thought of. Things really, there's an emergence of knowledge and wisdom that will come from that. And then finally, if you become a professor, you'll be on committees and there's never a dull moment. And that's a whole nother talk. Okay. So these big projects that I've worked on, the NESOTAC project, there's 5 core members of the team, and I've had at least 10 graduate students at master's and PhD level working on the project. The project with Professor Traxler is becoming huge. We've actually had to kind of move back and be more systematic and try to ramp it up in a more scalable level. I was having a real nervous attack this summer a few times, thinking, I don't know how to manage a project this large. Fortunately, I just got a grant, an internal grant from my university, and I'll be able to hire a research assistant and also provide support for our regional partners in remote marginalized areas. So thank goodness. But they're massive projects, and I'm in one case dealing with other researchers and community partners around the world. In my NESOTAC project, I'm working with professors in different departments around the university, the different colleges. What could go wrong, right? What could possibly happen? So put your thinking cap on there. And I don't know if you've already had opportunities to work on projects with professors, or but just think about that a bit, okay? And some of the considerations as you move into working in research projects, whether you're just a project member or I put the PI, that's the principal investigator. I wrote primary here. But who is that person? Who wants to take on that role? And I have conversations, very frank and open conversations, where we decide who is the best positioned from which department. I like to defer on occasion to somebody who has a good track record in obtaining grants. I'm perfectly fine to move a project forward by taking a step back in terms of the hierarchies. Who do you work well with? Make sure that you find people that you work well with. When you're building a team, you need to think about gaps. So for the project where we're going to talk about digital rights management, and I'm actually looking around Canada at specifically for Indigenous scholars who work in the area of law. It's a gap. It's something that we need to look at. And but as I'm doing it, I'm looking for people who would mesh well with our team. And then when you're entering into a research relationship, you need to think about division of labor. So in thinking about what could go wrong, feel free to let your imagination go when working on a research team. What are some possible problems that might arise? And you might have experienced these in group work. And this is potentially, dictatorships. So you might have experienced some of this in group works. And this is why group work might be a really important thing to do during your master's and PhD. A lot of students, I find when I'm teaching that they kind of think that, oh, group work, really, it's so much effort. All we're going to do is create a paper. But there are reasons that it's good experience. And I'm seeing some fantastic, right? Who is first author? Lack of communication, last author doing most of the work, clash of personalities, conflict of interests, silent, absent partners, absolutely. Procrastination, clash of personalities, everyone wanting to. Okay, you guys are experts. I think I'm done here. You guys, you've done this before. People not pulling their weight, arguments about direction. Yes. It's all coming back to me now as you're writing this. Different writing styles. Absolutely. Okay, so those are very unclear outcomes. Okay, my NESOTAC project started out with, we knew we wanted to create an app, but there's so much need for Indigenous language learning and teaching resources for all of our Indigenous populations here. We're like, well, what age do we start with? How do we want to do this? Do we want it to be a game? So we had actually unclear, we actually spent, I'd say, the first 3 months just talking about the direction we wanted to head in. And when you're working with, whether it's students or other academics, people have their day jobs as well. I call it their day jobs. Research is part of our day jobs, but we've got teaching, we've got other research projects potentially, we've got writing projects, there's committee work. And so, at times you might think, oh boy, Bob over here isn't pulling their weight. We really need this thing on time. What are we going to do? Here's a scenario. Okay, guys. So one of your research collaborators missed a writing deadline for their portion of a final report. What do you do? And again, so how would you manage this if you're, say, the principal investigator? I love that. Make sure they're okay. Thank you for writing that. See why they missed the deadline. Contact them. Ask if they need help. I love you guys. You are awesome. Check if they're all right. Yeah. Speak with them to find out why. Okay, so I really appreciate these responses because it's about communication and timely communication and regular communication. What I find with I have one, for example, service learning. Oh, are there any barriers? Perfect. I have one service learning course that I teach once in a while where the students do an instructional design project for an NGO in town. So we help a nonprofit organization achieve things. The students are totally overwhelmed. What I find is that even if the students are hung up for some reason, meeting regularly, I meet with them weekly and we talk about things, we talk about, challenges and stuff, but having regular communication is really really positive. And this is hope that you also planned extra time when giving the deadline. Yes. Okay. This is fabulous. Okay. So you guys are reading my mind. Plan ahead. So when I was a PhD student and a master's student, I had a paper due, I would give myself a deadline a week ahead of the actual deadline and really try to make that so that I had a few days somehow to do some editing and thinking. Plan those meetings ahead of time, discuss the deadlines ahead of time, and plan leeway into your timeline so you can nudge your colleagues. So you guys are on it. Talk to them. Communication is so key, and your responses were so humanistic and kind. People's lives and workloads are complicated, and what can we do to help them get back on track? You know, but once in a while, you know, you're doing the meetings, you've got the deadlines ahead of time, you're talking, and you're still not hitting those deadlines. So what if your collaboration just is not working? So put your thinking cap on here, and okay, this is a ranking opportunity here. So what I mean by cut them loose means you're the weakest link, you're fired. You can do the work yourself. You can see who else in the team has the capacity. Revoke their name from publications. Seek a mediator. Are there any other ideas? And so if you're using your app or your desktop, you should be able to, on the app, I can click and then move things up and down. And then once you've kind of decided, so the top will be the thing that you most recommend, the thing you least recommend, and when you're ready, submit your response. Okay. Okay, seek a mediator. Sometimes maybe a third party could come in, and a neutral party, and help you figure out what's happening. See who else in the team has the capacity. Now, ultimately, you know, if you're going to hit your deadlines, somebody's going to have to, okay, there's some good comments in the chat too. You're going to have to get something done, right? You know, whether it's a deadline to submit for a grant, if you don't submit on that deadline, you're not getting the grant. Or if you've got a publication and it's due, or a conference due date, if you don't get the paper in on time, you can sometimes email the conference, the head of the conference, say, I just need an extra day. And they can be very gracious about that. I see that what we've settled on is do the work yourself, which is not always possible either. Seek a mediator. Cut them loose was last. That's interesting. That is kind of a nuclear option, and revoking their name from publications is a nuclear option as well. That's when those kinds of things happen, when the collaborators are so miffed that they cannot possibly make amends and work together anymore. So those are, I call those the nuclear option. And Julie mentioned revoking their names seems mean if they have contributed at some point, and I totally agree with that. They, you know, in some way, they possibly have contributed some inspiration. They've contributed some kind of ideas, or, you know, can we find a way perhaps, you know, to avoid the nuclear option there? And so you have to address the immediate problem. If funding depends on the final report, doing the work yourself just lets them get away with it. Well, you know what? And this is the thing too. And, you know, I think most of us have difficulties with those hard conversations, but it does need to be addressed. You do need to talk to people for sure during this process. And it's also possible that in terms of cutting someone loose, maybe they would prefer that too in some instances. And that's why you need to talk to them, because they could be so busy, it can come as a relief to them. And so those open communications is really necessary. I don't have a definitive answer for you here, but these are the kinds of things that I would be kind of thinking of in working in major projects with lots of people. And Leo wrote, or give them a different task from Julie. Leo says it all depends. When people have struggles that interfere with them contributing, I think we would all want people to understand, because it could be any of us. Yes. So I always recommend trying to maintain an environment where you can have open conversations and supportive conversations. And we all do go through tough times. Yes. And so Julie, you're really thinking along some really positive ways of dealing with this. Ask them to do some editing later, or, or maybe when, you're really struggling, they can pick up for you. So you guys are just so facilitative, and you're just awesome. Okay. Yes. And Sue, you're right. There's potential for a funding crisis if the deliverables aren't there. Okay. So we've already kind of talked about, the potential of saying, you're not going to be on this publication. Again, total nuclear option. I recommend avoiding. Co-authoring. Now, whose name goes first? First off, it depends on the discipline. I have heard, I have not actually found a discipline that does this, but I have heard that in some areas, sometimes you want to be last author. I don't know. In my discipline, in my area, Julie, you're just you're ahead of me, Julie. Okay. Anyways, in my discipline, in my work, the gold standard is to try to be first author. Institutionally, we get more recognition for first authorship. But things to think about is who did the most work. This summer, I had submitted a paper with some colleagues to an organization called OTESA, which is a Canadian organization on educational technology. And when you submit, they actually ask you to give a percentage breakdown of who did how much work. And so they're trying to determine or find a way to ensure that there's that academic integrity in giving credit where credit is due. However, I have a scenario for you where we might challenge that. Whose inspiration was significant in the realization of the work? So to what extent do we give credit for that? If writing is based on a research project, who was the PI? Does that matter? Is it based on cultural knowledge, the work? So are you writing a paper that's based on cultural knowledge? And if there's other considerations and you want to put them in the text chat, please feel free. Okay, and Brett said yes, in some engineering medical disciplines, being last author is the spot. Oh, cool. Oh, you know what? That's acknowledgement of kickstarting someone's career. I like that. Leo, who has the biggest ego? Sometimes you're dealing with that for sure. Try and lead a paper that each other would contribute to. And yes, and Julie mentioned the possibility of rotating. We'll actually talk about these things right away here. Here we go. You write a paper for a class in your PhD program. You ask your supervisor to help you. Should your supervisor be a co-author? Okay, we in. How much help and in what capacity? That's a very good answer, I think. If you ask your supervisor to help you and they do a lot of heavy lifting, or you need to negotiate this with them and discuss how much do you want them to do and how much are they willing to do, and again, communication, right? You want to negotiate those things. I got to be really careful here. This is one area where it can be political. I have spoken to fellow students from years ago and who have told me that their supervisor would just tell them, I am the senior person on this paper, and therefore I go first. And I didn't want to shake her tree and make her feel bad, but I disagree with that. To me, there are all these other considerations that need to go into it, and it's not necessarily based on seniority. When I'm working with my students, I feel that it's my job to uplift them, but at the same time, I don't allow myself to be abused, right? So anyways, I've got some more scenarios here that will be, acknowledgement section, that is an option. That is and that's a lovely option. Okay, here's another scenario. You are working part-time on a research project for a professor, so you're an RA, a research assistant. You write 80% of a paper based on the results from the research project. Should you be first author, second author, or not included? It's a little bit of jostling between first and second author. Nobody said not included. Leo, people who choose C are bad people. I love it. Okay. Okay, again, you need to have the negotiation. So before you put 80% of your time and effort in this, you should probably talk to your professor. I'm actually really good at this now. At first, I was very timid about it. Julie, you might be able to make a change on your, I know on the app I can remove my vote and replace it, but again, I would talk to my professor. I would negotiate this, and I'd raise some of the different issues. And as a supervisor, however, regardless of whether or not I'm PI, if somebody were to come along and had the inspiration and the gumption to do 80% of the work here, I'd be like, I'm delighted to be second or third author. And again, but as PI, responsible for collecting data, responsible for research ethics and all that kind of thing, I think that you should make sure your PI is included. So, you know what, Huyen, that would be great if we could all be equals, but we're in this hierarchical system and I haven't seen it. And Sue mentions too, it depends on context. You can be joint. If you're from different institutions, they can both count as equal for the ref. Oh, for the reference. Yeah. Unfortunately, I think here at my institution, everybody wants to be first author. And it's that name that appears first, even if you do alphabetical, right? So, okay, another scenario for you guys. John, that's a fascinating comment. In ethnographic and phenomenological research, we should count participants as authors. I'm going to have to take notes here, and because these are things that I want to think about further. Okay, you're a PhD student. You're working on a paper with a full professor and an assistant professor. You've done 70%, the assistant professor about 15. The full professor says, I'm the most senior author, therefore I should be first author. Do you accept your fate? Advocate for yourself to be first author? Do you offer to be second author? Do something else? Okay, so some of you are saying accept your fate. Others are first author. Depends on your relationship with a professor. I think that you have the right to advocate for yourself, and you need to decide as well if you're going to die on this hill. Again, for me, I guess, I manage my research and writing relationships in a certain way. For me, whoever has done that 70% should be the first author, cateris paribus, assuming all other things are equal. And if I were that assistant professor, I would be advocating for the PhD student to be first author. Now, there are times when you're dealing with a real high flyer who's very, very powerful. I don't want to say this out loud, but you have to decide if you want to be affiliated, because maybe even that affiliation is good for you. But personally, I'd be advocating for the PhD student here. And Sue says, I have agreed to it, but started my own paper as first author. And in commentary with Sue there, I would also tell the full professor and assistant professor I'm going to head up a paper and I would like to be first author on it. I do think like I said, when I first started, I was very timid, especially when I was a master's student. And nowadays I would not do that. And I guess I'm in a position where I can now advocate for myself and for students. Little self-disclosure there. Okay, and I think this is my last scenario on authorship. I just wanted to get you guys thinking about this and advocating for yourselves. So you're working on a paper about culture, who knows, some other culture, some other part of the world even. You're not from culture X. However, your co-author is from culture X. You do 70% of the writing, most of the editing, citations, like a lot of the grunt work, while they contribute knowledge about which you cannot write the paper. Should you be first author or should you co-author? Should your co-author be the first author? Sorry. Oh, culture, I don't mean discipline. I mean, actually, so in my case, for instance, I work with the Cree people quite a lot here. And I am not from that culture, and I simply cannot do writing without them. So again, communication is going to be the key here. As I work with the Indigenous authors in my papers, we talk about it openly. And what I've come up with is something that Julie mentioned earlier in the Twitter thread, is that we sit down and we start planning out the papers that we're writing or the conferences. And I might take first authorship on one thing, they take first authorship on another thing, and we kind of rotate. We rotate around. And I always check with my co-authors. And there might be situations where we're presenting at a particular conference and it's to their benefit to be co-author for that particular piece. But in that way, we're trying to find a way to find balance. And I feel a very deep sense of obligation to show my respect and gratitude for them sharing their cultural knowledge with me, some of which is, some of it's sometimes tobacco knowledge, which is sacred and quite personal and private. Well, and Julie mentions too, whoever would have the most attraction and appeal. There are cases where if you are, say, first author, some of the communities might say, this is not cool. This is not valid research because it should be headed by someone from our community. And that's why also you need to have really good and lasting, ongoing, close relationships with some cultures. Like you can't just parachute in and people will work with you. In my context, I have a lifelong obligation to work with the people that I'm working with, which is a blessing. This is not a burden in any stretch. It's a blessing. Okay. Yeah. And decolonization. We're more and more questioning my work with Professor Traxler. We're questioning our publication systems, the journal systems, the hierarchies, we're really trying to problematize these things and bring to light some of these ethical issues. I find them ethical issues. And and disability research. I also, as part of the decolonization of digital learning spaces, I'm working with the Saskatchewan Deaf and Hard of Hearing. That's another culture. And so I will not write a piece about what we're doing without them. And again, I will be negotiating authorship and whatnot with them. Okay. The fun bit. Okay, so I recently did some publication in augmented and virtual reality with a former master's student of mine. And it was kind of fun to see her reactions to the peer review process. And I went, I've been there. Yeah, I know what that's like. And so I started collecting memes and sending them to her. And then we talked about how to approach it. And I attempted exactly, damn that reviewer too. And we had some fun with it. And I tried to be a good role model in how to survive the peer review process. So some of the memes that I found, Okay, I'm just going to move my screen here so that we can, here, I'll move this over here, so that we can see manuscript after major revision. So what direction do you go in here? My revised manuscript after I incorporated comments from reviewer 1, 2, and 3, the handling editor, the editor-in-chief, and the copy editor's requests. We'd like to thank reviewers 2 and 3 for their helpful suggestions. I was giggling about these last night when I was putting them in. And then this one's just lovely. The peer review is wild. It's like if you took your car to a mechanic and one mechanic said, "We noticed all your doors have rusted out. You should fix those." And another said, "Love the rusted doors, but have you considered adding a flamethrower?" And a third said, "It's not a horse." Those really made me giggle. And so now the important bit, of course, is what do you do with a rotten peer review? And believe me, when they come in, self-disclosure, my first reaction is always like, this is awful. Thanks, Puyen. Sorry, I'm going to wrap up very shortly. What do you do with a rotten peer review? My first perception is always it's really negative. I'll skim through and go, shake my head. But I have learned I like to read it through first, pause, and that might be a few days to a couple of weeks. And so then when I'm ready for it, I go back to it and I go, that's not as bad as I thought. And then I start going, okay, there's some interesting gems in here that I can locate and polish it. And, 9 times out of 10, actually, I'd say 9.8 times out of 10, I end up with a much better manuscript. And it's a little bit of me parking my ego somewhere and accepting the reviews. There are times when somebody will use a very harsh phrase. Personally, when I'm doing peer reviews, I try never to do that. I put on my teacher hat and I try to, as humbly as possible, offer suggestions and reflections. And I usually phrase it as, consider doing such and such. Or if you did this, then this would resolve that problem. And so I try to be as constructive. Puyen, bitch about the review on Twitter first, then take a nap, then act on the review. Hey, if that works for you, right? So in finding those gems, I find it really helpful to get very objective about it. Like I say, park your ego at the door and consider using a table. So I'm just going to show you Pet the Dog and Cat. Oh, I love it. So this is an example of an actual response that I sent to to editors of a book to which I submitted a chapter with my master's student. And, having taken that break, taken a step back, and I realized in the end that I need to thank the reviewers for their time. Because we're not paid to do these reviews. I consider it part of my job as an academic. It's a contribution to the field and the community. But I take the time to thank them for their feedback. I try to address every single comment or suggestion that they made. Oh, good. Nice approach that we learned on the Lancaster program. Mm-hmm. I try to be as professional as possible in my comments. There's times when you're just flabbergasted and you're getting conflicting, like one reviewer will say, do this, the other one says, do that. You at this stage are a professional in your field and you do have a say in this. And there are times when I will push back gently and say, now this is an interesting comment. However, based on my knowledge of such and such, I disagree and we decided not to implement this change. And now I believe, and maybe Sue knows more about it because I haven't done a lot I'm not an editor of a journal or whatnot, but I believe that the editors need to make the call in the end to say, this has been addressed sufficiently. This is a good reason for not doing this. These are good responses and the corrections have been done. I don't know how much time I have here, but I could go on and on. I will self-disclose and tell you, I had my first paper that I did in sociomaterialism. I sent it to a high flying journal, one that I would love to publish in. And I went around for 2 years back and forth with the same reviewer. And it was frustrating. And however, I learned some really key things. I learned to be much more sensitive towards some of the words that I'm using. And for example, one that kind of stands out for me is, so I'm writing in the area of sociomaterialism, but I use the word lens. And I said something about using a lens to view this issue, something like that. And they came back and said, well, that's a different metaphor, right? Because, in sociomaterialism, you're dealing with multiplicity, and a lens is a different diffractive kind of metaphor. And, that sounds like a really small thing, like you're really, nibbling away at details, and you are in a sense, but I really appreciate that. And so every time I write, I'm looking for the perfect words and how to put them together to accurately convey what I want to say. Now, in the end, we went around for 2 years. Reviewer 2 was the good guy this time and said, why am I seeing this for the 3rd time? This paper's fine. We should publish it. But reviewer 1 said, no, I still don't like it. So the editor, instead of making the editorial decision, brought in a 3rd person who said, well, this has gone through so much review. Let's reject it. Disheartening. Okay. So if your paper is rejected, be persistent. I had done so much and learned so much in doing this paper that I basically kind of spiffed it up. I looked for another journal that I like, and I looked at their requirements and, okay, I'm going to reshape this a little bit. I submitted it. And after the first review, they said, superficial minor changes, let's publish it. Okay, so that's one of the things that I want to leave you with right now is to be persistent in what you're doing and have the confidence in your work. Try to, get over the hump of a negative review because this is what's going to make you a better scholar. Okay, now for the second half of this lecture, I thought that what we could do is discuss paradigms of research, ontology, epistemology, axiology, and I figure we can get through this in about an hour. But seriously, okay. I am wrapping it up right now. That was a joke, okay? You guys look really serious all of a sudden, like, what's happening? I also wanted to leave you with a few things. Now, I follow all kinds of things on Twitter, and I actually find some great stuff, not just funny stuff, but I actually find interesting articles. And so I thought I'd leave you with these two because I think that they're a really positive way to end the talk. But so the PhD Voice put out there not too long ago, a PhD is all about becoming better at research. So it's normal to look back on your earlier work and see flaws in it. That's a sign that you've improved. And, even though you've done a PhD, you've probably seen that pie chart, right? And there's this little tiny sliver, and that's what you know at the end of your PhD, because there's a huge world out there, and I am gobsmacked. I learn something every day in many different areas of my work. Every day I learn something, which is what keeps me here. Now, Happy Researcher said, PhDs, don't be so hard on yourself if you're making mistakes. Always remember that PhD training is training to be a mature researcher, and mistakes are learning opportunities. Even mature researchers make mistakes. We get rejected. Our papers get rejected. And I've been at the university here for 8 years as now an associate professor. Sometimes, tenure is rocky. Sometimes you go for promotion and your colleagues say you're not ready. These are things that you need to be persistent with. There's always there's another challenge. But again, as I said, that is what keeps me here, is that constant learning and the constant challenges. Regardless of whether or not you decide to become a an academic at an institution, or if you decide to be an instructional designer, you decide, whatever it is you decide to do, I think that the PhD ultimately makes you into a good thinker, and you have a lifetime of learning ahead of you. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marguerite. If everyone could applaud either visually or by putting in the icon in the
I thought this was fun. I just kind of thought, what is an interesting topic to talk about, right?
really good insights as well, stuff that I've not experienced. So it's really interesting from my point of view.
I think with that, we'll
Yeah.
say goodbye for now, and hopefully
Great.
I'll get a chance to see folks again sometime in the future.